I'm George Galloway, and I present Kalima Horra on Al-Mayadeen television. Here we are in London. I speak my words freely, either in Parliament, on television, here on the streets of London. Kalima Horra means free word. That's what I speak. So Kalima Horra is a two-way conversation. Check it out on Al-Mayadeen television. Welcome to Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, discussing the issues of the world. It is a commonplace that the United States of America is at war all over the world. Hundreds of military bases, conflicts almost without number, sometimes direct, sometimes indirect, sometimes by proxy, sometimes by siege, quarantine, sanction, embargo, and increasingly by the politicized use of the dollar. So today we're going to be looking at the spectrum, the full spectrum dominance, as they would like it to be, of the United States of America. For once, not concentrating on the blood and fire and iron of physical conflicts, but the way that the United States is using trade and sanctions and the dollar to try and intensify its hegemony in the world. Some of the cases are more obvious than others. In the case of Iran, for example, there is a unilateral but extraterritorial attempt to sanction Iran to its knees. Ditto in Cuba, and for well over half a century, where the United States bans other countries in defiance of the other countries' laws from trading normally with Cuba. The war against Venezuela is taking multiple forms. Who knows, by the time this program is shown, maybe even the physical form. But the full regime change panoply of actions is already underway, in any case, in Venezuela. Russia is subject to sanction after sanction. I don't know if someone's keeping a score in Washington, but it must be the case now that hardly any Russian can go there. Hardly any American company can operate in Russia. In fact, the NASA space partner from the Russian space program was banned from entering the United States only a week or two ago. There are many others, of course, in various forms. The new element is this: former client states, former close allies and friends of the United States are growing tired of all of this. The proximate cause of that is the United States' unilateral withdrawal from the agreement reached between the permanent 5+1 and the Islamic Republic of Iran on the question of its nuclear program. Everybody else says the agreement is working impeccably. Indeed, the IAEA described Iran's performance in its duties under the agreement as pristine, that is, perfectly transparent, clear, and proper. But the United States' unilateral abrogation of its obligations under the treaty has created a major problem in Europe. The European Union, which strongly supports the Iran nuclear deal, wants to go on trading with Iran. The United States has threatened the European Union that any company, any country in the European Union which continues to do business with Iran will face themselves the full might of American sanctions. That's what you call American exceptionalism. This has provoked the EU to take special measures not taken for many decades to protect its companies and to protect, you might say, the honor of their countries. And the German foreign minister, no less, former client state of the United States, has called for an alternative to dollarization in international trade, because the US stranglehold on the international banking system, on the clearance of bills, on credit card transactions, the way in which the United States utterly dominates the current financial system ever since Bretton Woods at the end of the Second World War, may now be beginning to break down. When Germany says we can no longer trust the dollar, then trust may be fatally on the slide. Iran is now trading with China and other countries in other than dollar currencies. Venezuela just announced this very week, in fact, that it would no longer be using the dollar in its international transactions. It may be that this kind of resistance will turn out to be the most powerful form of resistance yet. We have, as always, an audience of distinguished experts and one or two enthusiastic amateurs like me. Let's kick off the debate with one of those experts. Sir, introduce yourself, please.
My name is Shiram Malik. What I would like to say is, very recently, I think it was in September, there was an article in RT describing how China and Russia have agreed to trade in their own respective currencies. Many countries have tried to do it in the past: Iran, Libya, Iraq, and dollar has always been backed by the military might of the United States. The idea of trading in gold was floated by Mahathir Mohamad, who's back in power now, between Muslim countries. And those ideas are now taking hold. Two of the reasons why United States is enforcing sanctions on Russia and on China and on some other countries like Pakistan, again, boils down to the fact that they do not want to trade in the dollar, at least amongst themselves. They're forecasting the trade between China and Russia to be in $300 billion in the next 10 years. And they do not want to trade in the dollar. And this is a direct challenge to the might of the United States and their hegemony. Hence the sanctions, hence the rhetoric coming out of Washington.
It's a red line, though, for Washington, isn't it? When Iraq made the declaration that it would henceforth trade in the oil markets in euros, it was one of the triggers for United States invasion and occupation. When Gaddafi floated the idea of an African currency,
yes,
and look what happened to him. When Venezuela made its declaration this week, wasn't Venezuela saying, well, the writing's on the wall, they're out to get us anyway, we might as well be hung for a sheep than a lamb?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the situation in Venezuela and the number of Venezuelans that are fleeing the country, it's sad to see how badly the general population is suffering because America wants to punish them. And a country that has the highest reserves of oil, some experts say more than Saudi Arabia, shouldn't be suffering this badly. They've got the infrastructure to deliver that oil. At current oil prices, the country is more than geared up to feed its people, and they're suffering. This has got to stop. Ultimately, you know, the historians say there's an equilibrium of civilizations. And we've got to that point where people will stand up and challenge the United States. And the election of Trump will only exasperate and speed up this process.
Adam Gary of the Eurasia Futures and the History Boys with me on Patreon. You are not one of Trump's enemies particularly, but is Trump a particular factor in this? Is the loss of credibility, for example, in Europe about the American currency and about the hegemony of the US dollar really intimately tied to the personality of Donald Trump?
I think the answer to that in the short and medium term is a resounding yes. In the long term, I think if Donald Trump didn't exist, someone in the United States would have to invent him, because all of the unilateral and hegemonic policies that he's pursuing are that which a U.S. wanting to cling on to this role as a leader of the world to which others are chained to America's freedom would have to implement these kinds of unilateral structures. They would have to weaponize the dollar. They would have to manipulate their currency. And speaking of which, the U.S. is always chastising China, even before Trump, as a currency manipulator. What do we think the Federal Reserve is? What do you think the U.S. Treasury Department is? These are the biggest currency manipulators in the world. The rate hikes of the Federal Reserve, the withdrawal of dollars from the international money supply have put such pressure on emerging markets in terms of paying back their dollar debts that they're saying, we don't want dollar debts in the future. We want loans from countries that are able to work with us on a bespoke level, that have a mutual need to see us succeed. China's relationship with Pakistan could be this way, and ironically, Saudi Arabia's relationship with Pakistan could be this way now that both China and the Saudis are in Gwadar, the southernmost terminus of the China-Pakistan economic corridor. So there's a combination of factors, one which is driven in the short term by Trump's acceleration of the U.S. attempts to hang on to hegemony, but the flip side of that coin is that America's no longer pretending that it isn't losing steam and influence in the wider world. Trump's whole campaign was run on nostalgia, make America great again, meaning we're not great anymore. Well, Trump is many things, but at that moment he was being very honest, and now there's not much he can do about that decline, but many will suffer in this interim period, sadly.
Professor Jude Woodward, you're a China expert. There are not formally sanctions on China from the United States, but a trade war has been launched by the United States against China, hasn't it?
An absolutely massive one. The sanctions have been put on now, 260 billion worth of goods, that are imported into the United States. These tariffs are at 20%. The aim is quite clear. The aim, when Trump first started talking about this during his election campaign, he said China was an unfair trader, that, as has just been said, used currency manipulation, and this had led to a trade deficit for the United States, which Trump said was unfair and had to be adjusted. And this is why was the rationale for the tariffs, to rebalance trade between the US and China. But what is the real aim of this was very clear from Trump's response to what the Chinese offered, because the Chinese offered, they said, okay, if you think the trade deficit is too big, we will start importing more American goods, particularly luxury goods, which there's a growing market for in China, cherries, beef, lobsters, but also cars, etc. And we'll reduce the trade deficit by that, we'll import more American goods. Trump wasn't interested in that. He was only interested in putting the tariffs on the Chinese goods. The aim is to crush China, to prevent China becoming a greater power in the world economically, and that is the aim of most of these sanctions around the world. It's not about who's done wrong or who's done good. It's about who is a threat to what the US sees as its position. And
I mean, the Chinese famously said many decades prematurely that the US was a paper tiger. It isn't a paper tiger. It's still a tiger. But isn't all of this demonstrating that it's a tiger whose teeth are falling out?
I think it's a tiger in its old age, but as you say, it's still a tiger, as you can see by the way it behaves. And I think that the lesson is that a tiger behaves in a particular way, and that is
because it's a tiger.
Yeah, if you lay down in front of it and say, "Oh, please don't hurt me," the tiger just rips your stomach out. Where the only response to a tiger is to fight back. And that's what the Chinese have been doing so far on the trade war. They've been refusing to accept the demands of the United States, which are that essentially China submit to a US set of rules as to how it trades. The kind of thing that's involved is we've just seen in the new NAFTA agreement. It's not called NAFTA anymore, it's called Canada, Mexico, US, which is not just about trade, it's about banning Mexico and Canada from using supply chains or entering into any new trade agreements without the agreement of the United States. So it's a complete interference in the sovereignty of other countries. It's not just about trade, and that's the case with China.
Extraordinary. Francisco, you're very active on the issue of Venezuela. I made the point in my introduction that Venezuela's declaration of abrogation of dollar so far as trading is concerned might be a last throw of the dice for the Venezuelans, in the sense that it might actually provoke the ultimate aggression by the US. What do you think of that?
We have to wait and see. The United States are busily preparing some kind of military activity. Venezuela is surrounded by military bases. 10 of them, which are controlled by the United States, are actually next door in Colombia. Colombia just joined NATO.
Yes.
Bringing,
of course, it's
the most
powerful North Atlantic power.
Bringing the most powerful military machine, next door to Venezuela. The United States has military bases in Puerto Rico, in Honduras, and in several other places. I could go on forever, but it's totally surrounded. It seems to me that there are difficulties that Venezuelans are not disarmed. All the analysis indicate that there would be a big fight if they were to go for it. The most problematical part of the intention of the United States is the ability of the United States to persuade regional countries in order to go for it. And just to give you an indication of this, Luis Almagro, the General Secretary of the Organization of American States, who is more or less in the bait of the United States, because he does whatever they want, called recently for military action by the United States and others in order to overthrow the government of Venezuela. These were his actual words. And the day after, the 14 countries of the Lima Group, which are in cahoots with the United States to try to overthrow the government of Venezuela, said, no, we don't like it. We're not in favor of it. And there was something else as well. The Minister of Defense of Brazil invited the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Venezuela to a meeting in Brazil where the two of them engaged in what they call openly confraternization in order to avoid anybody taking any steps which were silly, irresponsible, and so on, although now there is a possibility of an extreme right-winger being elected in Brazil. That might change. But if you take into account all the regional situation, the United States actually is finding it quite difficult to go for it, and not only because of the resistance it's going to find, but because the other countries are not willing to it. In the meantime, if I may add this, the United States is busily trying to asphyxiate the economy of Venezuela with incredible consequences. The Venezuelans are resisting reasonably well. In fact, the situation in Venezuela this year is much better than it was the year before, and is going to improve later on. And there are many Venezuelans who emigrated who realize how bad it is to be in Peru, in Ecuador, and in Brazil and other places that are coming back. And President Maduro has organized an airlift to bring them back. Several thousands already have come back. So the situation is improving. You don't demand that your government takes you back to what the media calls a dictatorship and willingly come in. The Venezuelans finally have designed and issued this currency, which is the petro. The petro is a cryptocurrency, but it's based on oil reserves. That is to say, the price of the petro depends on the price of the barrel of oil. And for the first time, the Venezuelans actually have a currency which actually can float in the world market and will reflect real economic activity. So in Venezuela in this year, 15 auctions of selling dollars have been organized, and the dollar fluctuates between 60 to 61 sovereign bolivars, which is the new Venezuelan currency. In other words, hyperinflation is beginning to fade away. And this step is massively helped by the very fact that the Chinese, after a visit by President Maduro to Beijing, accepts the two countries trading in petrol. Turkey has also accepted it. Russia is likely to accept, and several other countries are going to. So Venezuela is coming out of the doldrum, and this is the most dangerous part of it. Precisely because of this, the United States are more desperate than ever. So the situation can be the possibility of, an imminent invasion by the United States. But it seems to me that it's not going to be easy. They might get a bloody nose.
As is already evident, the difference between now and before is that when Iraq made its stand to withdraw from the dollar, Iraq was standing more or less alone. One of the unintended consequences of the recklessness of US hegemonic policies is that they have multiplied their enemies, both in quantity and in terms of the quality of the economies of the people they're now confronting. We'll be back right after this. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen television, talking about the use of embargo, quarantine, sanctions. These are forms of warfare which very frequently end up leading to actual warfare. And we're looking at who is standing up against the US drive to tighten its hegemony in the world. We took the cameras onto the streets of London to hear what the people thought. Let's take a look.
The US and its partners have imposed heavy sanctions on Iran, Russia and Venezuela. What do you think these sanctions will achieve?
I think there's much more to it than the official reasons. I believe that the US has the syndrome of imperialism by which they want to kind of enforce control over certain developing countries.
I think what they'll achieve is they'll make other countries more skeptical of coming here, coming to the United States. I think that we're making more enemies than allies. And I think that it's going to come to a head, not now, but probably in the years to come.
Well, economic sanctions often can drive countries into repression, right? I mean, fundamentally, you look at what happened over the last 50 years in Cuba. And no, I disagree with the sanctions that the Americans would impose. That's the difference now between where we are in Canada and the South with Donald Trump. He is essentially the big bully who is throwing his weight around. I'm embarrassed to live next to the United States now.
I don't know. I think it's the sanctions are mainly kind of a show for the layman people, I would say. It's kind of like, I'm sure they're still doing business around, let's say, even America and Russia. They still do a lot of business, but it's just kind of, we need to show the world that we're not happy with Russia doing it. It's more like a show for the layman people who kind of watch TV sort of thing. And it's kind of for the people kind of like, I guess that's kind of the idea.
Do you think that these sanctions are fair on these countries?
So I understand that Trump is trying to kind of block out foreign people from coming to our country because they think that it's a bad thing. But no, I think some of the sanctions aren't good. I think that they'll ultimately have a backlash.
Well, very interesting views from the public. America's the big bully. That was a Canadian speaking. Or it's all just for show that these things are announced. It's politics by in another form, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the path to war is being paved. Let's continue with the discussion. Yes, the young gentleman in the middle.
Yes, my name is Joshua Megan. I think the one outlier to all of this that so far we haven't yet mentioned at all is North Korea. Now, this is the one, if you like, the anomaly to all of America's stranglehold over, well, basically what it seems is a lot of the world. I think that it's either the biggest case of smoke and mirrors that you could ever see, even from a man like Trump, or it is a beacon of saying, well, yes, if you defiantly resist us, we will strangle your economy. But if you are prepared to work with us and to give an overture of diplomacy, then the consequences that will bear sweeter fruits. So I think that Trump is giving us this sort of binary diplomacy of either
carrot and stick.
Yeah, exactly. And in my opinion, he did also say to Iran, actually, like, there are no conditions. If you want to work out a new deal, I'm open to listen. I'm not that I'd like to defend him. There's certainly no excuse for what America is doing to the Venezuelan economy. I mean, they basically are depriving them of the most basic, exports. People are dying of, organ failure because they can't get anti-rejection drugs. People are dying of starvation because they can't import any food. So it is a tragedy, and it's certainly not to be overlooked. But I think that Trump, in his rather sort of, if you like, binary mind, he's trying to give an alternative, and he thinks that this sort of binary opposition is the best way to do it.
Adam Garrett, is North Korea an anomaly? It seems to me that our friend might be right, that actually the North Koreans haven't made any meaningful concessions, and yet they've gone from being insulted as the little rocket man to more or less new best friend status. Is that a kind of, well, let's call it an anomaly, or is it something that other countries might copy, for example?
I'd call it a strategic anomaly in a very made-for-TV fashion that only Trump could pull off. Right now, I think Kim Jong-un needs to be given the credit that very few people are giving him. He's walking a very interesting tightrope right now, but the results of which have been the following. At this time last year, Russia, China, and the United States, in an increasingly rare moment of unity at the UN Security Council, were all saying, yes, sanctions on the DPRK are correct. Now there's a kind of silent bidding war brewing between Russia, China, the US, and others will join. India's the elephant in the room there in particular, over who can be the first to be the major investor in this new open economic era that's right around the corner for the DPRK. So the US is well aware that while Libya shook hands with Bush and then Obama murdered Gaddafi, and while there are many other instances of the US destroying a nation that it once made deals with. Look at Iraq. Saddam was best friends with Donald Rumsfeld in the 80s. We all know what Donald Rumsfeld's role was in the early 2000s. So it's not just people on, let's say, my side of the geopolitical spectrum that know that. The Americans know it too. And they need the DPRK to be an example to the world to show, look, we don't kill all of the people we do deals with. And the reason strategically that this anomaly has arisen is because, one, the US can't realistically start a third world war on the borders of China and Russia. So war with the DPRK in any realistic sense is out of the question, and it has been since Douglas MacArthur was sacked by Truman for suggesting dropping multiple nukes on the DPRK and China. So if you can't beat them, join them, and if you can't join them, why not compete with them? The US and China are in a quiet tug of war to see who can be first, and then Russia and India aren't far behind. It will be interesting to see how this develops over the next, let's say, 2 to 5 years.
Interesting. Yes, sir. What's your view?
I'm Shaikh Shuja. What makes me wonder is that under US hegemony, more and more countries, particularly Europe, and also you can see in Brazil now and India, all are turning right wing. And there seems to be a contradiction. On the one hand, the people are suffering under this capitalist regime. And why the people of these countries are still do not understand that in the long run, these policies will not work.
I think that right wing doesn't necessarily mean quiescent to American domination. I mean, the Iranian government, not exactly left-wing, but it rejects the idea that the United States will dominate it. The Venezuelan government is left-wing and equally rejects it. The Italian government is part left, part right, and it's rejecting not necessarily US hegemony, but globalization. Ditto in other European countries. Ditto in the Brexit vote here in Britain. It's not necessarily a left-wing thing. It's, if you like, a rejection of other people too far away that you don't elect and can't remove, controlling your life, don't you think? Who else would like to come in? Dr. Jude.
The whole situation is not so simple as moving right or left. However, I do think we should be very clear that if Bolsonaro wins the second round of the Brazilian election, we have quite a significant geopolitical change, because Bolsonaro is not just right-wing, he's a fascist. Moreover, he's very open about the fact he's been working with Steve Bannon. You have these agents of the US now, of the alt-right, far-right in the US, operating all over the place. And Bolsonaro and Bannon are extremely close. So you have a shift of Brazil to back into the orbit of the United States. It's a huge country. It's what, the 8th biggest economy in the world? Something like that. I can't remember exactly. And this is a huge geopolitical change. I think we haven't seen anything like this for 20 years.
Oh, yes, but let me test it. Because Modi, for example, the Prime Minister of India, you couldn't get much more right-wing. But he's not in favour of allowing the United States to tell him what to do. He's rejecting the idea that he can't buy military hardware from Russia, for example. And this is why I'm saying a left-right dichotomy. It doesn't actually fully explain the current picture.
I think the difference with Bolsonaro is that he is not a Brazilian nationalist. He does explicitly have a back into the US framework policy for Brazil, whereas Modi was always, right from when he stood for election, clearly a right-wing, but an Indian nationalist, and didn't want to see India as the plaything of anybody, the United States or anyone else. And so...
We're like that, don't we? I mean,
yeah,
I don't like Modi, but we're like that.
Yeah, that's a step in the right direction. I'm in favour of countries in the world being able to determine their own future without the interference of the US. But if Bolsonaro brings the US back into the picture, then it makes it much tougher for Venezuela, for example.
I take that point, yeah. Comment on that, Francisco, please.
I mean, I agree that Bolsonaro is a fascist, and, that will produce a shift of the nature that you're talking about. However, on the 1st of December, López Obrador is going to be inaugurated as the left-wing president of Mexico. And he's already taken steps. For example, he's cancelled the purchase of several military helicopters that were ordered by the previous administration, the current administration, to Mexico. He's already taken several steps. For example, he's offered these Honduran caravans, thousands of Hondurans who are actually making it to the United States because they are desperate after the coup d'etat that the United States organized in that country, producing a huge amount of repression. López Obrador is offering them work permits. That's his response to the crisis. And he's already said several times, López Obrador, after several interviews, he said Mexico will not serve in any way whatsoever to actually attack the sovereignty of other nations, particularly Latin America, whereas the current administration is central to the Lima Group and has been central to the attack and the hostility against the Venezuelan government. That's number one. So that's.
But before you leave that, as the professor pointed out, the new NAFTA, in fact, is much worse than NAFTA. It is very explicitly negating important parts of Mexico's sovereignty.
Absolutely. That's why López Obrador already said in several ways, sometimes cryptically, sometimes more openly, that he wants Mexico to orient itself towards either Latin America as well as Asia, and he means China. China is already investing very heavily for the future in that country. So that's the thing. And it seems to me that it's quite important to bear in mind the following. Were Bolsonaro to win it doesn't mean the end of the world. It will be very terrible. It will offer the United States opportunities. But the United States won, let me put it that way, the elections in Argentina. And that country is in a state of prostration. I mean, you know, when the previous administration of the left actually left the country, the external debt of Argentina was $150 million, something that anybody can pay any day of the week. Now it's 157 billion. And that is in a year and a bit of Macri neoliberal administration. And if you
it's an economic catastrophe
it's a
in an American ally country.
And therefore the position is the United States can only offer, compared to China, that China offers you credit, markets, technology and investment. The United States offers you military bases. And the result is Macri. And, you know, Brazil is going to be worse in that sense. So it seems to me the United States has a complete inability, because of its decline, of offering anything to consolidate the political gains he may make, you know, in the meantime. And I think that's their weakness. The dollar is going down very badly.
Clip that, put that out on the internet. Who else would like to? Doctor
Tom Biershonik, doctor and freelance journalist. I think there seems to be, although Trump has said he wants to make America great again, there seems to be a bit of a, should we say, austerity for imperialism, or a slimmed down version of imperialism. America can no longer project its power the way it used to. It's had to withdraw from the Middle East to an extent. It's had to withdraw from Africa. So it's going back to its traditional approach of trying to treat Latin America as its own backyard, as it did in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So instead of being able to project its power abroad, it's trying to concentrate its power on dominating countries close to home. As you said, George, Colombia has become the latest member of NATO. America is supporting various right-wing political forces across Latin America. However, it must also be said that although America is trying to overthrow Venezuela, Venezuelan government, Maduro, is in discussion with Russia for Russia to have a military base in Venezuela. Now, think how that would throw the spanner in the works. Russia stopped Syria going the way of Libya and Iraq. If Russia has a military base in Venezuela, again, it's going to scupper American plans.
How serious is that? That would be quite a risky thing for President Putin to do.
It would, but everyone also knows...
He likes risks, is that what you're saying?
I think Putin's very cautious. He doesn't do anything unless the odds are in his favour.
I think that's a very important point. Like Stalin was a very cautious person, Putin is a very cautious leader. I'd be very surprised if he set up a military base in Venezuela. This is Kalima Horra. Be right back after this. You're watching Kalima Horra with me, George Galloway, on Al-Mayadeen television, coming to you from London, discussing the American attempt to wage war by other means, by sanction, quarantine, trade wars, and by the use of the hegemonic dollar. We took the camera onto the streets of London to see what the people thought. Let's take a look.
The EU and various countries are unhappy with how US sanctions are affecting their economies and are now looking for ways to work around American sanctions. Do you think it's a good idea?
I think USA is still very powerful, and you know, like anything that they anything they want to do, they kind of go ahead with it, you know, which I think is sometimes it's a bit too much. I think all the other nations sometimes should have more of a saying.
Absolutely not. Like I said before, it's going to ultimately have a negative impact on us. And what I think will happen is that other countries will see that they don't need us, and we're not the powerhouse that we used to be. And so I think ultimately it'll have a negative impact. Once countries start going around the United States, it's like, well, what do we need them for? Other than, you know, the trade that we do have, because we're big consumers. But yeah, I don't think that that's a good idea for us, not for other countries.
The Americans are not the big player anymore. They like to think they are. You still go down there and they still think they're the biggest. But you really look at the BRIC countries, right? Brazil, Russia, India, and China. They're going to kick the ass. I mean, there's more cell phone users in India alone than twice the population of the United States. So in terms of economic power, absolutely. The smart thing to do is to work around the United States.
America is the big superpower. That's kind of, they kind of say, okay, these are the sanctions, and everyone should follow. And basically when America does it, there is no opposing force sort of thing. So it's kind of, basically the idea of thesis and antithesis. Basically the America, they provide a thesis of, okay, this is one idea of doing it. And then there has to be an opposing force that kind of fights it in order just to actually make progress. So I think it's good to work around the sanctions, yeah.
So do you think the US dollar will remain the base currency in the world? Or do you think other countries might step up and take that role from America?
I think probably other countries will take over soon, and especially also with digital currencies these days and all that stuff. I think the money kind of thing is really changing over time. The dollar is not that powerful.
Well, in the past, from what I remember, people were trying to do that, and then next thing you know, there was a civil war in those countries. I don't think smaller countries can do it, but maybe with BRICS, maybe can think of something and maybe go oppose the dollar, maybe.
All those things we just talked about, that will help make a better economic group, and I think it's very smart that they work around the United States, because that really demonstrates influence across the rest of the world, that the Americans aren't the place to be the all-seeing, all-powerful group anymore.
Very clever people on the streets of London who can make a good government out of our vox pops there, I think. Let's continue the discussion. Yes, the distinguished gentleman at the back.
Thank you very much, George. Julian Morrow, fellow keen amateur. Recently, Jeremy Corbyn said that as Prime Minister he would recognise a so-called Palestinian state. Why did he not say he would call for sanctions on Israel, and shouldn't a country in breach of international law be sanctioned by the international community? I know it's a stupid question, but give it a go.
It's not stupid, but it belies the constellation of forces within the Labour Party and within the British society. The stand that Corbyn has taken over almost half a century for Palestinian rights has already cost him very considerable amount of political blood, and I'm sure that the evaluation is that further steps such as you advocate would be more expensive politically than they would be worth. After all, if they turned out to deprive the possibility of a Jeremy Corbyn government in the first place, we wouldn't be better off by the fact that he'd strengthened his policy stand towards Israel. Instead of demanding Jeremy Corbyn impose sanctions on Israel, maybe, given we're on Arabic television, we should start with the Arab countries and demand that they impose sanctions on Israel first.
Wain al-Milliyin. Where are they?
Indeed. Yes, gentlemen here.
Basically, I just want to add a couple of elements to this discussion about the left and the right impact. Basically, what my thoughts are on this is, like, with Trump, he has obviously like a wild way of speaking and quite open and just a little bit foul-mouthed, and that is just like a certain section of America that maybe speak like that, that's come into, let's say, power through the right side of the politics spectrum. Now, what we have here in England, we have Corbyn, who's like a left-winged politician that's a straight talker as well. So a more polite straight talker. What I want to see is what would happen if these two got together and they're actually forced to do a meeting, because I think a lot of truths would actually come out.
Well, look, I do think it's probably material for another programme, but what is left and what is right is a very interesting philosophical position. There's a lot of people on the streets of London today who think themselves left. They are actually marching for something that, in my view, is right. Right wing.
That's correct.
Many of them support war against poor countries abroad. Many of them were followers of Tony Blair, Alastair Campbell, his information chief, and so on. So they think they're left. A lot of people think that they are left. I don't think it is left to support NATO, to support the European Union, to support the Iraq war, Seems to me that if you do these things, you are the opposite of left. Equally, there are people who will be booing at the march in London today, who many people would say are right-wing. But when you examine issue by issue, like these issues, you might find that these classifications are no longer entirely useful.
Yeah.
The lady in front of you, please.
Can I add one more?
You want one more point?
Yeah.
Sure, I interrupted.
Just one more, sorry, one more dimensions I want to add to this, going on to your previous points with other countries and with the left and right dichotomy. With India, you mentioned with Modi being quite right-winged. Something that's always forgotten amongst my own Pakistani community, obviously I'm a British-born Pakistani Muslim, is that the Pakistanis are quite nationalistic too, and fairly right-wingish in Pakistan. Big on flag waving, on Eid and everything, yeah. And from this, what I'm trying to gauge is that it's okay. It seems okay and like all wholesome and culturally collective when certain countries are, let's say, waving flags. But then certain countries are seen as being far right or racist for raising their flags, which I think is a bit unfair.
I think that makes the point I just made.
And just to add my final point to do with, let's say, the whole EU left-right dichotomy added into this mix is, let's say, for example, something like the student loans. As you can maybe help me clear this up, you know, obviously being a famous Scottish person yourself, is to do with something like an example of student loans. So, I mean, my thinking on this is like the student loans came into being in place as a product through the EU, because before we had free education here and grants and into university. In Scotland, you can still benefit from that as Scottish-born citizens. So under EU rules, if I'm correct, if you have a rule in place for your citizens, under EU rules, you have to offer those same benefits to anyone coming in under freedom of movement. So under Scottish rules, would they then qualify for free education? And is this why we've got student loans now?
Well, no education is free. Somebody is paying it. And the English taxpayers are paying to the Scottish government to give free university tuition to Scottish students and French students, German, Slovakian students. But English students going to Scottish universities have to pay the tuition fees. Go figure.
That's all it was. Thank you.
The lady here.
Hello. Tammy Al-Kabani. I've lived firsthand under US sanctions, so I do know how it affects people. But I just want to add, don't be too harsh on the Americans.
Tell us how seriously you felt that impacted. I want to explore the point the person made in the Vox Pops, that actually these things are all about show. The lived reality of the people in the country is not much changed when these sanctions are imposed. Was that your experience?
No, they do change. The price of food goes up, money transfers, housing, everything is affected. Medicines, essential medicines, citizens cannot get. And even in countries, I was in Syria and they manufactured most of their own medicines. And so the US came along and bombed the hospitals instead and bombed the manufacturing plants to really make sure that they couldn't even do that. So, it does affect you. It affects, even the price of bread, everything. And it's done to cause unrest so that the people become unsettled, they complain, and ultimately they blame their government when actually it's, the governments that are imposing the sanctions. But it's tough. But, there are countries that will work around that. If you're in a tough situation, you're either going to go down or you're going to go round or rise above it. And
what doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Yeah, and they're they're stronger. They produce a lot.
Well, that's happened in Cuba, of course. The long half century more than of economic war against Cuba has been the mother of invention in Cuba. And Cuba now has world-class, world-leading industries and specialities that no one else in the world could dream of achieving. So there is a possibility of import substitution, of relying on yourself, on finding other friends, making new relationships. I mean, I liked the line of the wonderful young black American woman on the Vox Pops. I hope she goes into politics. People are going to start asking, she said, what they need us for. And that's really my question. What do we need them for? I mean, a Ford Mustang, maybe. I might buy a Ford Mustang, one of those open-top ones that looks like a 1950s one. But I don't want to buy anything else from the United States. They want to stop me buying from them. I'm cool with that. There are plenty of other places and plenty of other things that you can buy. Last word.
And just to add, don't be, as what I was going to say before, is don't be too harsh on the US when it comes to Venezuela, because, you know, with all the sanctions they put, you know, on the people, they stopped short of putting sanctions on the oil because they said they didn't want to tip the people over the edge. So they were being quite nice, you know. They just didn't want to go as far as to sanction the oil. So they're not all bad, are they?
Very good. Yes, gentleman at the front.
Chris McGroarty, fellow Irish Scotsman.
Yeah.
George, just to answer your question, aren't America the leaders in medicine, developing medical technology?
Well, they once were, but the health condition of their own people is drastically falling. If you're a child born in Havana, you're going to live longer than the child born in Washington, D.C. You've got more chance of surviving birth than you do if you're a child in Washington, D.C.
Yes.
So, I mean, we're pretty good at medicine. Cuba's wonderful at medicine, probably the best in the world. So, sure, I mean, I don't mean to denigrate the United States, are great people. We want to be friends with them. We're two people divided by a common language. I like their music, their boxers and so on. I just don't want to be ruled by them. And I won't accept them telling us what we need to do. That's healthy, is it not? Jude, last word to you in this half. No, Chris, go on.
Yeah, could I just come to a point I just wanted to make,
Sure.
ask yourself?
Sure.
One of the root cause of the sanctions on Iran is that Iran wanting to develop nuclear energy and develop nuclear weapons, which is completely within their right, completely legal. So what difference is it Iran having a nuclear weapon as opposed to Israel having hundreds of nuclear weapons, or Donald Trump having thousands of nuclear weapons? Iran have never invaded.
Well, I've never quite understood the answer to that point, but Iran doesn't have nuclear weapons, has no intention of making nuclear weapons, is adjudged by the international police agency that covers these things to be entirely innocent of the charge. In any case, the nuclear file is a pretext. They want to destroy Iran because of its growing political influence and power, particularly in the Arab world. We'll be right back after this. You're watching Kalima Horra on Al-Mayadeen television, talking about US hegemony on the business, trade, currency front. Professor Woodward, as I said, you're a distinguished author and academic on all things China. Final word, please, from you.
Is not to underestimate the residual power of the United States. Its companies remain some of the most powerful companies in the world, and China recently went through a very bad experience that taught it this. America sanctioned a company, the largest mobile phone manufacturing company in China, that's ZTE, and made it against the law for any American company to put inputs into that phone. There are only two operating systems in the world on which you can run a smartphone. One is Android and the other is the Apple system. And if ZTE was blocked out from the access to those technologies, it could not make smartphones. And that's the end of it. And that remains the residual power of the United States, and why the question of trade wars and sanctions are one of the most powerful things it has left up.
Why can't we just steal that technology? I mean, I used to go to Cuba a lot, and we'd watch American movies in the cinema. And Cuba didn't pay for these movies, they just nicked them. Why not? If the Americans have got an embargo on you, why not?
Well, I suppose if you can get away with it, you could. But the problem is it then rolls out, which is that if you break what's imposed on one thing and something else gets imposed to something else.
Yeah.
That's what the European Union have found in relation to the sanctions on Iran, that its supply chains are so engaged with the US that even though the EU doesn't want to go along with breaking with the Iran agreement, many of the European companies are going along with going back to the sanctions regime because otherwise they suffer too much from losing access to American parts of their supply chain. We live in a globalized world, and the US remains the home of some of the largest tech companies in particular in the world. That's gradually changing, but it is a great power that it still has, and why this particular method of sanctions and trade wars and so on are the route it's going down at the moment, because that's where its residual strength lies.
Francisco.
I think one of the good things about the situation, when it doesn't defeat you, it makes you stronger, is that there is only one possibility, which is resistance. And to be not very hard on US sanctions. US sanctions normally are a prelude to something much worse. And in Latin America, the number of people who have been assassinated, orchestrated, organized, funded, and instigated by the United States is hundreds of thousands. Just in Guatemala, it's 720,000 in 10 years. In Argentina, 30,000, I can go on. In Iraq and in other places, we're talking about millions. So the reason why the United States doesn't want to go into, stopping the oil supply from Venezuela to the United States, because they need it. And the Venezuelans have been smart enough to reduce their dependence on their export to the United States. In 2002, when the US organized the coup d'etat against Chavez, Venezuela was exporting 58% of its oil. Now it's 13%. And they can stop that in 1 week, Venezuelans, if they wanted to. But we know that if Venezuela were to do that, it would be seen as an act of war followed by a military invasion. And one example of resistance is Nicaragua. The United States unleashed all its power over the last recent period against these little countries, about 5 million people. One of the second poorest in the region. And the Sandinista government was able to resist successfully the onslaught by the United States. And if you see the situation of the United States in terms of the economy, and I'll finish with this point, it has a GDP of 18 trillion roughly, and it owes 22 trillion. And Trump just increased military expenditure by 1.5 trillion in the last 2 years on the basis of debt. And then he reduced corporate tax from 35% to 15%. How the hell are you going to finance what they're trying to do? It's a complete nutcase. And the only thing they can think of is pressing the military button. And therefore, we can succeed by resisting them. And I don't want anybody to get the impression that we should be light on their intentions, which are really horrible and nasty.
Quite so. Lady behind you.
Yes, what I wanted to say was that I saw a video, a YouTube video, where a lot of Americans have left America and have landed in Mexico, because, and it was strange because we hear about Mexico is all the drug wars, the murder rates, and all that stuff. And here were it was like a huge colony of Americans who had left America since the time of Bill Clinton, once NAFTA kicked in, once the private prison industrial complex have kicked in. People's wages had stopped dropping, and the healthcare system got worse. They moved on, and they claim that whenever they go to America now, they can't wait to come back to Mexico, which is quite strange. And they have no plans of going back to America because
well,
they
it
think
would appear from the Vox Pops, quite a few of them in London too. Thank you for that. Doctor, last word from you.
America may try to project its power via sanctions, but the embargo against Cuba failed, and sanctions are certainly not going to work against Russia. America, sure, may be powerful enough to absorb a trade war with China. For now, at least, it may be powerful enough to absorb sanctions against Russia, but actually it's America's allies who suffer. America's pushed the EU nations to also sanction Russia, and actually the EU has lost billions in trade. Hungary's lost about 8 billion in the last several years. Italy's lost billions, so has Germany. the extent where actually business communities within those countries, within Italy, Germany, Hungary, are actually pressuring their governments to break with America. Don't follow America's line. Make your own deals with Russia. And Russia, in the meantime, is actually going stronger. It's relied more on domestic production rather than importing. So it's substituted domestic products for imports. It's also formed stronger links with China and India and other countries to the east. So we've got Eurasia. While we have the EU getting weaker, we have the Eurasian bloc getting stronger.
They say there's no God. Adam.
Well, I think to just pull back and look at the long-term development of all of the things touched on, we need to realize that the key, I believe, to almost everything discussed here is China's monetary policy. China could sell off all of the US Treasury debt that it has, allow the renminbi to freely float, its value would go up, and that would cause economic shockwaves. On the other hand, they could simply do nothing, and that would allow the trade war to put increasing pressure on China and cause inflation. Instead, they're doing something in between, which is a masterstroke of moderation. And it's understanding the Chinese mentality of taking the long view, a gradualist approach that is really the key to why I think by at least by 2040 at the latest, China's overall GDP will be the highest in the world. Its currency will be the reserve currency. So just what is it that they're doing? To avoid further inflationary pressures from the currency manipulators in the Federal Reserve and in the White House, they're selling off a bit of the US Treasury holdings to prop up their own currency. At the same time, they will not do what Japan disastrously did in 1985 and allow their currency to overly appreciate, thus destroying their ability to trade and make a decent living for their people from it. It's this moderate approach in monetary policy in particular, but in development, in bespoke bilateral relations, that China will be ahead. America, everything is instant gratification, instant trade war, instant sanctions. China won't do today what you'll expect America to do tomorrow, but looking to the longer term, in 3 decades' time, China will not only be ahead of the United States, but from the position of this, what will then be an old video in 2018, it will be shockingly ahead. People won't even believe it was a question. The answer will come, but it will come gradually.
Final word from you, sir.
I agree with the gentleman here. It's the slow approach that you need to take in the long run that will ensure China has its hold. Now, the policy of recreating the Silk Route, it's a long-term policy and it's going to reap benefits. And one of the reasons why Saudi Arabia has been invited to join and establish a major oil city in Gawada is also a long-term view of the overall economic flux that we find ourselves in. The floating of Aramco is still a big issue, and I think that relates back to the murder of Jamal Khashoggi as well, but we'll come to that in some other program. So overall, I see China as a safer bet in 10, 20, 30 years' time as opposed to United States.
Yes, Madame.
For my conclusion, I think it's really, really important just to clarify that sanctions are an act of war. I think too many times now we think it's just dropping bombs or weapons, but sanctions are part of that.
It is literally an act of war. I mean, unless it's authorized by the Security Council of the United Nations, it is an illegal act. It's an act of piracy, brigandry, just like the US and UK military actions in Syria. These are illegal acts. And illegal acts doesn't actually quite describe them. They are criminal acts.
They target
that
the
in a
most
just
vulnerable.
world would be punished for. You'd get sent to prison for bombing Syria without any legal basis. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say they target the most vulnerable. So what the bombing doesn't get, the sanctions will. Sick children, elderly, the really most vulnerable in society. And I think it's very, very important just to clarify the sanctions are an act of war. They kill. And just, we mentioned before about nuclear weapons, and I'd just like to bring to everyone's attention, I'm sure the US and the UK will remember they signed a treaty for the prohibition of nuclear weapons, which was their promise to abolish nuclear weapons. Far from doing that, they have not only expanded their range of nuclear weapons, but they're then dictating to the rest of the world. And I think they need to remember that treaty is still a contract that needs to be honoured. Trump is very into his business and contracts, and he needs to be aware of that. So
I don't think he's famous for honouring his contracts somehow. So the United States is still a tiger. Its teeth might not be falling out, but it's showing its age. Meanwhile, there are young tigers now emerging onto the field. No wonder the Americans are anxious. They wanted the 21st to be a new American century, and that idea didn't even last half a decade. Their defeat in Iraq, their inability to regime change, even outside the congestion charge area of Kabul. They have spent decades and trillions on Afghanistan, and the people they were fighting against are at the gates again already. So the United States hegemony is fading. It still has power, but that power is on the wane. That's certainly, I think, the conclusion of our debate here this evening in London. It's been marvellous. On Al-Mayadeen, Kalima Horra, this is George Galloway bidding you goodbye.